All right, let's look at a question of how to identify unused tables. There was an article recently in the community about identifying unused tables, and I liked what the author was trying to do because I think it was very valuable in the sense that there are environments that there's just a lot of tables and a lot of them aren't being used. And so I applaud the author for attempting to think about that problem because that can be a very big challenge depending on the environment. There's the downside to that, which is it could be a situation if you took that advice that you were terribly misled based on the information. So a couple of things, when you look at like sys tables or sys objects and you're looking at, like, for instance, a modified date, you're looking at the date that the object itself was last modified. That's a very different it's very different than the last date that the table received data. Okay, you also have to understand that just because something hasn't been modified doesn't mean it's not being used. Let me give you an example. Suppose you say, well, there's been no data that's come into this table. Well, what if it's a lookup table? Okay, so, well, okay, well, we'll look at the indexes. Okay, you can do that, and that's a very valid thing, but just be careful about going and removing it thinking that nobody, by the way, how much does a lookup table really cost, too? If it's truly a lookup table and it's small, what benefit do you get from just removing that? So there's some things to evaluate before you do these things. So there's a strong possibility that you can't do this, or there's a possibility, I should say, that you can't do this. And even if you can, the monitoring effect to prove that a table is unused may be more than the benefit of removing an unused table. Now, there are certain exceptions to that rule. If a table is taking up, let's say a terabyte, and it doesn't really seem like anybody's using it, well, then there may be some value in removing that table. Okay. So the first thing I like to ask is, what is the purpose of the database? Because if it's an OLTP environment, we expect certain behavior in that environment with the tables that we have. Same thing if it's an OLAP environment, we expect certain behaviors of the tables in that environment. For instance, if you think about, let's say, a dimension table or a fact table, there's just certain things we're going to be doing in an OLAP environment that we're not going to be doing in an OLTP environment. The other thing I like to look at is, what are the reads on the index and what are the user updates? So you can get this, of course, from a dynamic view, but the thing is how long have you been tracking this? And you have to be very careful, because if you haven't been tracking this for very long and the last restart was very recent, you can get some very, very inaccurate information. So be careful, because again, this is not something that you want to go take and assume, oh, look, there hasn't been an index read in a month or two. Okay, well, that may be totally normal. Okay, this is where really understanding what the purpose of the database is for. Great example of that, I've seen environments where they may break out, let's say, by breakout tables by like users specifically. And what would happen if that user has been on vacation for 3 months and that's why there hasn't been any reads? Like, be careful about going and dropping things that imagine you are the client behind the scenes, right? So you don't want people to go around dropping your stuff. Okay, and then so my point on the index reads is that doesn't prove anything, absolutely right. How long have the row counts remained unchanged, and what about aggregate values? Well, what I mean by this is, so suppose you find out you've been tracking a table that you think is unused, and there's, a million records, a million records, a million records. There's always a million records. Okay, well, there's one problem with doing that, though. What about inserts and deletes? What if the same amount of inserts and deletes happen? So you can look at aggregate values. So you're basically taking, like, let's say, the sum of a numeric column. These two combined, the idea is the probability is that if data are changing, even by the same row count number, so, 2 in, 2 out, more than likely the numeric value will be changing on some level. But even then, there's a probability that data could be coming in and out, data could be added and removed, I should say, and yet the numeric values stay the same. Low probability, but there's still a probability of that, okay? So this doesn't prove anything either, though if you combine this with the reads on the index and the user updates, it definitely starts making a stronger case. Then finally, can you find the object in the application code or within the backend code? And this goes back to, what is the purpose of the database and how have you built the database, right? So think about it this way. If you know that the way that the application is built is that it uses, let's say, entity framework, then go pull up the model. Where is the table included in that model? By the way, that's another reason why you should be careful about removing a table when you don't know these things. Might have an effect. So I was trying to think if I want to say one of the versions of entity framework I worked with, if you went and you removed something in the database and you didn't take it off the model, the application developers got an error. But maybe that's not how it was. But I remember we received a lot of errors about the model, and one of them had to do with there was objects that were removed, and yeah. So be careful, because again, if some DBA thought, oh yeah, just remove this, whoa, what are the application developers using? What are they accessing? How are they accessing the database? If, for instance, they are using stored procedures or views to look at all the tables, okay, well then what you want to do is then you want to go through all of those and see if the table is referenced in the stored procedures and in the views. And in fact, I believe I have an article and even a video in which I actually loop through every object in the database and see if a table is referenced, because that's something that I've had to do. In a mixed environment where you have some people use entity framework and some people use that approach, it's going to be a lot of work to do this. So when you combine these three, four approaches, and you understand what the purpose of the database is, you will have a better idea about whether a table is used. But I would really, really caution, and incredibly caution you to be very careful, very, very careful about removing a table that you think is unused. There should be a lot of discussion in this, and you really want to be speaking with your application and database developers. So I think the article was great, and again, I applaud anyone who attempts to look at this issue, because it is very complicated, and it can, in some environments, unused objects are definitely can be a problem. But I would be very careful about just assuming that, oh, well, the modified date is, ooh, whoa, that's not what you think that is. And then the other thing, too, as well, is be careful about the underscore. Just because something is underscore temp or underscore something doesn't mean you can remove it. Some people do naming conventions like TB underscore. Some people do underscore temp, and what that is that's just a staging table. That's just how they do it. Even TBD, which generally means to be deleted, but that can mean something else too to some people. So just confirm, and I think the best approach, by the way, from an DBA side is have a schema where when you copy, let's say, a backup table and there are objects that you want to remove, have your own schema for it. And then you can loop through that schema and just drop all those tables later on after like a week from when they were created. I think that's a better thing to do from an organizational standpoint. But you have to ask, well, but what are the application developers and the database developers doing? And if they don't have permission to do those things, you don't have to worry. But if they do, okay, well then that's a problem. So those are just some suggestions that I would make. We could probably talk about this topic for a long period of time, because again, there's more to it than just, oh look, it hadn't been modified, well I'm going to go drop it. Got to be careful, and definitely make sure you have a backup and you've had the conversations you need to have before making that assumption.